All right, now we're going to focus on graphing functions and looking at how different buttons in the top menu here will actually help us in calculating certain things about functions that we have graphed. Now I'm going to take a look at graphing a couple things quickly. So let's go ahead and go to y equals, and I'm going to type in a couple of functions here. X squared minus 3x, there's one function. And the next function that I'm going to put down here is cosine of x. Okay, there it is. And press enter on that. Now again, what's showing up here on the right is what would happen if I press the graph button. So what you see right here on my screen is what will happen if I press the graph button. Ah, there it is. Now remember, I entered these two graphs, and then I told it to graph them. Under mode, you'll notice that I am in sequential. So it graphed y1 first, and then graphed y2. Now, if I go back and change this just slightly, I could show you what it looks like to graph them simultaneously. Okay. Under y equals, I'm going to add another function. This last function will be sine of x plus 3. Okay, and there it is. And now I'm going to press graph. And now take a look at what happens now. All of the graphs are being graphed simultaneously. There they are. So you need to be able to interpret which one is which. That's kind of a problem at times because, well, these two look very, very similar. So we need the ability to modify our window and also to kind of modify our graphs. Here's a couple techniques to use. One technique is this. For example, those two graphs that looked very, very familiar, I could press the left button, and now you'll notice it's blinking over here. If I press enter, it will now choose a thick line for this graph, so I can tell which one is which. That might be extremely helpful at times. The other thing I can do is I can turn a graph off. So I may still want this graph in my memory, but I can press enter while I'm on that equal sign, and it will turn that one off. Let's hit graph again and see what it looks like. There they are. Again, they're being graphed simultaneously. So you can clearly see here's the bold one. That's the graph of cosine x. The lighter one is the graph of sine of x plus 3. Let me go back to my mode and put it back down to sequential. There it is. Now, if you take a look at your graph here, it's graphed on a certain window. Here's the difference. Of course, one function graphed at a time can also make it easier. You wouldn't need necessarily to have one in bold. But if you notice, I've got all this white space on my screen. It's very hard to see things that are happening at a small level because the graphs are so compact. Sine and cosine have outputs varying from -1 to 1. So it really doesn't help to have all the values from -2, -3, -4, all the way down to -10. You can adjust the window on your screen by clicking the window button. Currently my window goes on the x terms from -10 to 10, and it puts a little dot every 1 unit. The y minimum, that's the lowest on the y value, goes from -10 to 10 as well. So you are in charge of adjusting this. So for example, maybe I only want to go from -2 up to +2. And I'd like to count by every little 0.5. Well, let's take a look at what that's going to look like on the screen. As you can see, you get a lot more vision of what's happening with your function. There's the 2. So that window feature is really going to help. Additionally, if you were to change it in this way, let me go down here and say I'd like to go from 0.8 up to 2. Again, sometimes you'll change it and you won't realize what's exactly happening. There's my graphs. Yeah. That really is the graphs I have. It's just showing a tiny little piece of them. So you're in charge of the window, and you need to understand that it controls what you actually see of the graph. Let me press this zoom button because I think that's going to be a very nice button for you guys to have. Under the zoom feature, there's a lot of numbers. These are submenus. You can press the number 6, which will get you back to a standard negative 10 to 10 on both axes graph. And that's probably the one we're going to use quite a bit. Alright, so that's kind of the big button that you'll probably want to use. Other things that you could use under the zoom are the zoom in. So I'm just going to click on that very quickly, press number 2, and then press enter, and it will zoom in. Now you're not really in charge of the zoom factor. It does kind of let you pick where you're zooming in from, but take a look at the window now. It's moved in. It was 10, and now if you take 10, divide that by 4, you get 2.5. So that's the zoom factor. So if I go back and press zoom out, which is number 3, it will zoom back out to the original window. And I could continue doing this. I could zoom out again if I wanted to kind of get a more global view of a function. So here I've zoomed out once again. For this function, it's really not useful. Take a look at my window now, which again is now negative 40 to 40. The only problem here is that my function only goes from negative 1 to 1. So taking a look at the graph here, you can kind of see it. I can't see any detail of this function whatsoever. But what I could do is hit the trace button. The trace button allows you to trace any of the functions in memory. And y2 is equal to cosine x, so I could simply trace it, and it gives me outputs as the cursor moves along the function. Yeah, it's very hard to tell what's going on here, so I know that I'm in charge of this function, so I'm going to go down to the y values and say I'd like to once again go from negative 2 up to 2. Now go ahead and graph that function for me. Oh, there it is. That's much more helpful. And I have the entire graph on screen. Oh man, that's really busy with those two graphs. If I really want to look at cosine, let me go back, and even if I want the other function for later, I can always temporarily turn the sine function off. So there, I've turned the sine function off. I'll just have the one function showing on the screen now. The reason this is quite helpful is then if I want to trace just one function, I know that's the function it's going to be tracing. So what you notice is it kind of does give me little values on the screen, points that are on this curve. The x value is 8.51, the y value is negative 0.61. And I could continue doing that as I choose. So again, the window, if I want to get back to a standard window, I press zoom, but sometimes you know what you want better than the computer. So maybe you just want from negative 5 to 5, press graph. There's your function from negative 5 to 5, and you don't have to sit and wait for the computer to tell you what it thinks is a good one. But there is one piece that could be helpful for you, and that is, go down a little bit further. There's one called zoom fit. And zoom fit, you press 0, and the zoom fit function tells you what it thinks the best window to view this is. If you take a look at its window, it's pretty close to what we had, but it does have a minimum of negative 0.9987. I don't know where that came from, but there's the y max as well. So it's pretty much negative 1 to 1 as you look at it. So you could go down and say, oh, that's a decent window, but I can make a better one. Sometimes you want the entire thing, but just a little bit outside of the actual range of the function, so you get a little bit more of a view of what's going on. So you can definitely see the minimums and the maximums of this function. Speaking of, one of the nice features of the TI is its ability to calculate something. So I'm going to press the second button. Let me clear my keystroke history here. So now that we have this on our screen, what we could do is take this function and try to calculate one of the mins or maxes of this function. So I'm going to press second and then the trace button, which will get me into the calculate mode. In the calculate mode, second trace, there we go. In the calculate mode, I can calculate a value, a specific output value when I type a specific value in. I can calculate the zero of a function, which is where it touches the axis. You should remember that from Math 111. It'll calculate a minimum or a maximum. So I think I'm going to go down here and choose minimum, just for an example. Press enter. Now what it does is it asks me for the left bound. So what it's going to do is use some numerical methods to calculate the lowest point in a certain region. And so I'm going to say my left bound is somewhere over in here. I'd like again to find the lowest point, so I'm going to find that point right there. And then the right bound I want to be over here. Again, just make sure that your left bound is on the left-hand side of where you want to find the minimum, and the right-hand bound is on the right. Click that, and now my calculator is saying, okay, between these 2 points, I'll be looking for the minimum. Then it asks you to guess, which is really kind of random, but it basically is starting an iterative process, a process where they take your guess and return closer and closer approximations until they get to what they believe to be the minimum. So get close to it, and then press enter. And there it says, the minimum at this, in that little interval that I chose, is 3.14159. Oh, that's interesting. I'm sure that's an important number somewhere. And the minimum value of y is 1. So the input is here, the output is there. In that same mode, I could go in and find the 0. So I could find where the function crosses the axis. Once again, it asks me for the left bound. In this case, I'm just going to show you, you can just type a number in. I'm going to say x equals 0 is my left bound. And over here, x equals 3 is my right bound. So now I'm looking between these two to find where the graph actually crosses the axis. Once again, it says guess. I'm just going to type in 0.2 and say that's my guess. And it says, here's the 0 that we've calculated. And you'll be surprised. Occasionally, it will come up with some number that seems extremely strange, but because of the iterative process. So you still have to do some thinking with this calculator. But you can at least get a good approximation most of the time. Let's take a look at what else it can do. In that menu, I can calculate a single value by telling the calculator, I'd like to find the output when x equals 0.2. It will find that value. Now, as you're going through the trace menu, you can continue clicking and find a whole bunch of values, but maybe you want one specific value. So while I'm in this mode, what I can actually do is just type a number in. Let's see what happens at x equals 3. I type in the number 3. 2.1. If I type that number in, it interprets it as if I wanted to find the output at that value. Back to the calculate menu. Notice it also has a maximum. We found the minimum. The maximum is found the same way. The intersection, that's a fun one. We're done for now. We're going to come back with another video on the intersection function and how to use it. But remember, this is your calculator. Play with it. You're not going to break it by pushing buttons. And we'll see you next time. Off you go.